If you look at a map of the Middle East today, the lines of conflict seem like they've been carved into stone for centuries. You have the axis of resistance, that's Iran and its proxies on one side.
Hmm.
And then you have Israel and the United States on the other. It feels ancient, doesn't it? Like this is just the default setting of the region.
It certainly feels that way when you're just scrolling through the headlines. It feels, inevitable.
But, and this is what completely floored me while going through the research for this deep dive,
Hmm.
this alignment is actually incredibly young. In historical terms, it's a toddler.
It is.
We aren't talking about a conflict that goes back to biblical times.
Yeah,
We're talking about a war with a very specific birthday.
exactly. Historians and geopolitical analysts often call this the Nameless War. It's a conflict that's been raging for over 40 years, spanning the entire region, but it was never officially declared.
Right.
And if you want to understand the tension we see today, you don't look at ancient history. You look at February 1st, 1979.
That is the date everything flipped. So today we're doing a deep dive into the origins of this Iran-Israel-U.S. conflict. We're going to unpack how the Middle East went from a region where Israel and Iran were, and I'm not exaggerating here, strategic soulmates, to the bitter rivalry we see now.
And we aren't just talking about diplomatic handshakes. I mean, they were practically developing weapons of war together.
We're basing this deep dive on a really comprehensive documentary transcript. It's titled Iran, Israel, and USA, The Endless War. It covers
Wow.
everything from massive intelligence failures and secret escapes through angry mobs to the accidental birth of modern asymmetric warfare in the rubble of Lebanon.
It's a fascinating document because it really peels back the ideological layers to show the raw strategic moves underneath. It shows how specific decisions made in the late 70s and early 80s are, still dictating the rules of engagement today.
So let's rewind. We had to start with what the sources call the Forgotten Alliance. I think most people today would be shocked to hear that in the 1960s and 70s, if you were an Israeli diplomat or general, Tehran wasn't a forbidden city,
No, not at all. It was basically a second home.
a second home.
It was. And to understand why, you have to look at the map through the eyes of the 1950s. Israel was a very young state, completely surrounded by Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, that did not accept its existence. I mean, they were totally isolated.
So they needed friends who weren't their immediate neighbors.
Precisely. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founder, came up with this doctrine called the Alliance of the Periphery. And the logic was simple. If our immediate neighbors hate us, let's make friends with the nations behind our neighbors.
Non-Arab nations on the edge of the Middle East.
Exactly. That meant Turkey, Ethiopia, and most critically, Iran.
Because Iran is Persian, not Arab.
Right. And under the Shah, Iran was aggressively pro-Western and secular. It was the perfect match. The sources describe the cooperation as indescribable in its depth. There were thousands of Israelis living in Tehran, businessmen, engineers, military advisors.
And we aren't just talking about selling oranges or textiles here. The sources mention a specific deal that just made my jaw drop. In 1977, that's just 2 years before the revolution, there was a huge defense contract on the table.
Yes, the Project Flower era. It was a $1.2 billion deal.
$1.2 billion. And that's in 1977 money. That's an astronomical amount today.
But it was massive. It was basically an oil for weapons trade.
Hmm.
Iran provided the funding because they were flush with petrodollars, and Israel provided the top-tier technology. We're talking about joint development of advanced missile systems.
The source even mentions plans for a jointly developed fighter jet.
And that's the detail that really highlights the what-if of history, Imagine if the revolution hadn't happened, you could have had a world where the Iranian Air Force and the Israeli Air Force were flying the same plane, developed by their combined engineers.
Wow.
That's how deep the trust was.
It's wild. You had an Israeli military attaché, Isaac Segev, sitting in Tehran, implementing a billion-dollar missile deal. It honestly sounds like alternate history fiction.
But it was reality. And the United States was the glue holding this all together. For Washington, the Shah was the ultimate strategic asset. The source uses a great phrase. He was the joker in the poker game.
I loved that description. The Joker.
It means he was the wild card that let them win the hand against the Soviet Union. The Cold War was in full swing. The U.S. needed a strong man in the region to hold the line against communism and protect the oil flow.
The Shah was their guy.
He was their guy. They poured weapons and support into his regime because they thought he was invincible.
And that belief that the Shah was untouchable seems to be the root of the massive intelligence failure that followed. I mean, the documentary is pretty brutal about the American blind spots here.
It's a classic case of echo chambers.
Yeah.
The American intelligence agencies in Iran, they only spoke to the people they were comfortable with. The elites, the generals, the upper crust of society who spoke English and drank scotch.
They weren't exactly walking through the bazaars or talking to the religious students in Qom.
Not at all. They were completely disconnected from the street. The source mentions that when American officials asked the Shah's generals about the protests starting in 1978, the generals just dismissed it completely. They said, it's like the measles.
Just the measles. That's
Yeah,
incredible.
it happens every year. The Shah tells us to solve it, and we solve it. They fundamentally misdiagnosed a terminal illness as a seasonal rash. They thought the status quo was permanent.
That is just such a fatal error, because down on the street, this wasn't a rash, it was a revolution. And this brings us to the real turning point. The moment the psychological bond broke, September 1978, Black Friday.
This is the day everything changed. Protesters gathered in Jaleh Square in Tehran. The Shah's army opened fire. Now, the official death toll released by the government was 87,
Okay.
but the opposition claimed it was 4,000.
That is a huge discrepancy.
It is, but in a revolution, the truth matters less than the perception. And the perception was that the Shah had declared war on his own citizens. And this is crucial for our story. Who did the people blame? They didn't just blame the Shah. They blamed the pillars holding him up.
The U.S. and Israel.
Exactly. There were rumors circulating everywhere that Savak, the Shah's brutal secret police, was actually being run by the CIA and the Mossad.
Right.
So when protesters burned down cinemas or attacked banks, they saw themselves as attacking Western imperialism. They weren't just fighting a king, they were fighting a foreign occupation by proxy.
So fast forward to February 1st, 1979. The Shah has fled. And Ayatollah Khomeini is on a plane from Paris to Tehran. The scene described in the documentary is just cinematic.
It's one of the largest gatherings in human history. The source says 10 million people on the streets.
10 million.
10 million. Just try to visualize that sea of humanity.
And the Shah's government just evaporated. It collapsed in 10 days.
And this is where the great switch happens. This is the moment the gears of history grind into reverse. And for the Israelis still in Tehran, it was absolutely terrifying.
Oh, this story was gripping. So the embassy is overrun. But there are still 33 Israeli personnel hiding in safe houses. They are trapped in a city of 10 million people who have been chanting death to Israel.
They had to get out, and they couldn't exactly take a diplomatic flight. The plan they came up with was incredibly risky. They waited for a week, hiding in the dark, and then they all gathered at a hotel and boarded a bus to the airport.
A bus, just driving through the heart of the revolution.
A 17-kilometer drive.
Yeah.
And the streets are lined with crowds armed with, as the source puts it, tomatoes and eggs, but also Kalashnikovs.
And the only reason they weren't dragged out of that bus and lynched is because the crowd thought the bus belonged to the revolutionaries.
Can you imagine the tension in that vehicle? The source says they didn't dare breathe or speak Hebrew until the plane actually crossed the Iranian border. Only then did they break out in cheers. It was a literal escape from the jaws of history.
And it's almost like a revolving door, because as the Israelis are fleeing for their lives out the back, a new guest arrives in Tehran to a hero's welcome, Yasser Arafat.
The leader of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. This was highly symbolic. Khomeini didn't just welcome Arafat, he gave him a gift. He handed him the keys to the Israeli embassy.
Literally gave him the building.
Physically transferred the building. They took down the Israeli flag and raised the Palestinian flag. It became the first Palestinian embassy in the world.
That is such a powerful image. It really marks the definitive end of the alliance.
It does more than that. It reframes the entire conflict. Before this moment, the Palestinian issue was largely seen as an Arab nationalist cause. It was secular.
Right.
Khomeini turned it into a religious duty. He declared Israel a usurper planted by the West in the heart of the Islamic world. It wasn't just about land anymore, it was about theology.
And then, of course, the U.S. gets its turn. November 4th, 1979, the storming of the U.S. Embassy, the hostage crisis.
444 days that defined U.S.-Iran relations forever. But here's what's interesting from our deep dive. The sources suggest Khomeini didn't actually order the students to storm the embassy initially.
Really? I always assumed he was behind it from the start.
No, it started as a student protest. But once it happened, Khomeini saw an opportunity. He used it.
It became a domestic power play.
Exactly. He called it the Second Revolution. By focusing everyone's anger on the great Satan, the U.S., he was able to unite the country and sideline the moderate leftists who had helped him overthrow the Shah but weren't interested in a theocracy.
So it was a masterclass in political maneuvering.
Absolutely. He used the hostages to consolidate his own power.
So by 1980, the lines are drawn. Iran is now an Islamic republic. The U.S. and Israel are the enemies. But Iran is also kind of stuck. They get invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and they are fighting for their survival in a brutal war.
Yeah, really brutal war.
They don't have much bandwidth to fight Israel directly.
Right. They're fighting trench warfare against Iraq. Millions are dying. But then, in 1982, Israel does something that inadvertently changes the entire game. They invade Lebanon.
This is Operation Peace for Galilee.
That was the official name. The goal was to crush the PLO, who were launching attacks from southern Lebanon. Ariel Sharon, who was the Israeli defense minister, wanted to push them back 40 kilometers out of artillery range.
But he didn't stop at 40 kilometers, did he?
No, he kept going all the way to Beirut, and he managed to force Arafat and the PLO to flee to Tunisia. On paper, it was a tactical victory. He kicked the bad guys out.
You'd think that would be the end of it. Mission accomplished.
But this is where the law of unintended consequences kicks in hard. By crushing the secular PLO, Israel inadvertently woke up a sleeping giant in Lebanon, the Shiite population.
And this is where Iran sees an opening. Even though they are in a massive war with Iraq, Khomeini sees a chance to strike at Israel. But he can't send an army across Iraq to get there.
So he comes up with a slogan that becomes a grand strategy. The road to Jerusalem goes through Karbala.
Let's unpack that. Karbala is a holy city in Iraq, right?
Yes, for Shiites. So he's saying, we have to defeat Iraq first, but we can plant seeds against Israel elsewhere while we do it.
And the seed was planted in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Iran sent the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC. But again, how do you get troops from Iran to Lebanon when there's a hostile Iraq in the middle?
You make a deal with Syria.
The Syria connection.
Hafez al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, needed oil. Iran had plenty of it. So Iran gave him oil, and in exchange, Syria gave Iran access to Lebanon through its territory. And that is the moment the axis of resistance is born.
Wow.
Iran, Syria, and the group they were about to create, Hezbollah.
So let's talk about the birth of Hezbollah. Because initially, the Israelis didn't even see them coming. They were focused on the PLO. Who are these guys?
They were young, religious Shiites who were deeply inspired by Khomeini's revolution. The source mentions Naim Qassem, who was just a chemistry teacher in Beirut at the time.
The chemistry teacher. That's not exactly the profile of a warlord.
No, and that's important. These weren't just mercenaries. They were intellectuals and true believers who bought into the ideology completely. He and others went to Iran, swore allegiance to Khomeini, and returned to build something new.
And this something new wasn't just another militia. It was a new way of fighting. This brings us to a really dark but pivotal moment. November 11th, 1982. The first major suicide attack.
This is the story of Ahmad Kassir. He was an 18-year-old kid. He drove a white Peugeot loaded with explosives into the Israeli military headquarters in the city of Tyre.
The devastation was total. The building was leveled. 91 Israeli soldiers died.
It was a catastrophe for the IDF. But the most telling part is how Israel reacted. They initially blamed a gas explosion.
They thought it was an accident.
They literally couldn't conceive of the alternative. The idea of martyrdom operations, someone willingly dying to kill the enemy, was completely foreign to their strategic thinking at the time.
Right.
They were used to fighting secular armies, or the PLO, who, generally wanted to live to fight another day. This was a religious paradigm shift.
The Karbala paradigm, as the source calls it, the Shiite concept of sacrifice.
Exactly. And because Israel didn't understand it, they couldn't stop it. The tactic worked. It was repeated in 1983 against the U.S. Marines, killing 241 Americans, and against French paratroopers.
And it worked politically, too. The West packed up and left. Israel eventually withdrew to a security zone.
It was Hezbollah's first major victory. It proved that asymmetric warfare, suicide bombings, guerrilla tactics, hiding among the population could defeat a superpower. It showed that a small, committed group could bleed a conventional army until they quit.
But there's another layer to Hezbollah's success that the expert in the documentary points out. It wasn't just about bombs. It was about what they call the parallel state.
This is crucial, and it's why Hezbollah is still here when other groups have vanished. You can't just be a militia, you have to be a society. Iran helped Hezbollah build schools, scout troops, clinics, construction companies.
So they fill the gap where the actual state is failing.
Right. A child would be born in a Hezbollah hospital, go to a Hezbollah school, join the Hezbollah scouts, and eventually become a fighter. It creates a loyalty that bombs can't destroy. It's total social integration.
So when we look back at this timeline, 1979, the revolution creates the ideology. 1982, the invasion of Lebanon provides the battlefield. By 1985, the architecture of the modern Middle East is basically finished.
Absolutely. The nameless war we see today, the proxy battles in Syria, in Yemen, the tensions on the Lebanon border, it's all using the playbook that was written in those 6 years. The IRGC, the proxy militias, the asymmetric tactics, it all started there.
And the irony is just, it's heavy.
It is.
In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to destroy a secular enemy, Arafat, and the PLO that was annoying them on the border. They succeeded. They got rid of them. But in doing so, they created the conditions for a far more dangerous, religiously motivated enemy to rise in its place.
It raises the ultimate question of strategic foresight. In trying to solve an immediate tactical problem, the PLO artillery, they created a long-term strategic nightmare. They traded a secular nationalist enemy that could perhaps be negotiated with for a religious ideological one that deals in absolutes.
And those are much harder to defeat on a battlefield.
Much harder. It's almost like that measles comment from the beginning, a misdiagnosis of the situation leading to a treatment that makes the patient, or in this case, the region, much, much thicker.
That's a very apt analogy. The failure to understand the underlying currents, religious, social, psychological, led to decisions that we are still living with 40 years later.
So when we see news today about tensions between Iran and Israel, or sanctions or proxy attacks, we need to remember this isn't random violence. It's the continuation of a very specific war with very specific rules that were established in 1979 and 1982.
Both sides are playing a long game.
A long game that was set in motion decades ago. Iran is still using that strategic depth concept, using proxies to keep the fight away from its borders. And Israel is still trying to find a military solution to an enemy that is embedded in the fabric of the region.
It's a chess game where the pieces haven't changed, even if the players have gotten older.
And the board is the entire Middle East.
You know, there's one final thought I want to leave our listeners with. We talked about the $1.2 billion defense deal, the Project Flower.
Right, the missiles and the fighter jet.
I keep going back to that. It's such a powerful what if. If the timeline had shifted just a few years, or if the Shah had somehow managed to hold on, we might be looking at a Middle East where Iran and Israel were the twin pillars of regional security.
It's a fascinating thought. But history took the turn it took, and instead of flying together, they've spent 40 years locked in this nameless war.
A war born in the rubble of 1982. That is a lot to process.
It is. But understanding these origins is really the only way to make sense of the chaos we see today.
Thank you for guiding us through this. It's a complex web, but connecting these dots makes the picture so much clearer.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you on the next one.